The heavy oak doors of the throne room slammed shut, the echo ringing like a death knell against the cold stone floor. "You cannot mean this, David," Lisa whispered, her hand instinctively pressing against the slight swell of her stomach. The child, his heir, Alpha King David, stood by the tall, arched window, his broad back turned to her. Outside, the rain slashed against the glass, mirroring the sudden, violent storm within their bond. When he finally turned, his eyes, usually a warm, molten gold, were flat, unreadable iron. "The decision is made." His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through her very bones. "For the safety of the Silver Moon Pack, the Luna must be exiled. Leave before dawn, Lisa. If you are found within our borders after sunrise, you will be hunted as a rogue. 5 years, 5 winters of biting frost that seeped into bones, 5 summers where the sun felt more like a threat than a comfort." Lisa stood on the precipice of the jagged cliff, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face like a tattered banner. Below her, the sprawling expanse of the Silver Moon territory stretched out, a sea of emerald pine and silver-leafed birch. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was no longer hers. She pulled her heavy wool cloak tighter against the chill. Beside her stood General Kyle, a towering figure of scarred muscle and quiet intensity, the second in command of the Obsidian Vanguard. They weren't a pack in the traditional sense. They were a coalition, survivors, outcasts, those who had seen the underbelly of alpha politics and decided they'd had enough. Now, they were a kingdom in their own right, and she, against all odds, was their chosen leader. "The border patrols are weak in the western quadrant," Kyle murmured, his eyes scanning the tree line below with practiced precision. "They rely too heavily on the natural barrier of the Whitewater River." Lisa didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on a distant point, where she knew the grand, imposing structure of the Alpha's estate lay hidden amongst the ancient trees. David always underestimated the river when the snowmelt came early. She noted softly, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. A small hand tugged at the hem of her cloak. Lisa looked down, the hard lines of her face softening instantly. Leo, 4 years old, with eyes the exact, devastating shade of molten gold as the man who had banished them. "Mama, are we going to see the bad wolves now?" Leo asked, his voice clear and untroubled by the gravity of their location. Lisa knelt, ignoring the damp earth soaking into her boots. She brushed a stray curl from his forehead. "Not bad wolves, little one. Just wolves who forgot how to share the forest." Kyle shifted slightly, a silent reminder of the time. They needed to move before the sentries caught their scent on the wind. "We move at twilight," Lisa announced, standing and turning her back on the Silver Moon lands. "We don't strike, we negotiate, but we negotiate from a position of absolute strength." The journey back to their temporary encampment was silent. Lisa's mind raced, pulling up old maps, old vulnerabilities of the pack she once called family. Why had he done it? The question had gnawed at her sanity for years. The accusations of treason, the sudden, inexplicable coldness. He hadn't even looked at her stomach, hadn't acknowledged the life growing within her. The betrayal was a physical ache, a phantom limb that throbbed when it rained. Back at the camp, fires were kept low, burning smokeless wood. The Obsidian Vanguard was disciplined, a stark contrast to the often chaotic energy of traditional packs. They respected her not for her bloodline, but for her mind. She had spent the last 5 years turning a ragtag group of exiles into a formidable military force. That evening, in the dim light of her command tent, Lisa reviewed the missive they would send. It was a formal request for parley, signed with her new title, Commander of the Obsidian Coalition. She did not use her name. Let David think he was meeting a stranger. Let him feel the shock. He will recognize your scent, Kyle pointed out, leaning against the central tent pole. I'm counting on it, Lisa replied, rolling the parchment and sealing it with unmarked wax. I want him off balance. I want him to know that the woman he threw out to die is the one holding the knife to his throat. Kyle didn't smile, but a glint of grim satisfaction entered his eyes. And the boy? Lisa's posture stiffened. Leo stays here, heavily guarded. David doesn't get to know him. Not yet. Maybe never. She touched the small silver locket at her throat, the only thing she had taken from her old life. It was empty. The picture of them, smiling and naive, had been burned the night she crossed the border, freezing and alone. Send the rider, she ordered, her voice devoid of emotion. Tell the Alpha King of the Silver Moon that the vanguard demands an audience. David sat on the carved wooden chair that served as a throne, feeling the weight of the crown more acutely than usual. The throne room was empty save for his beta, Marcus, pacing restlessly by the hearth. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a heavy silence that had settled over the pack since the strange missive arrived at dawn. The Obsidian Vanguard, Marcus muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. They're myths. Boogeymen used to scare pups into behaving. They don't have a structured leadership, let alone a commander who demands an audience on our soil. They are real enough to have amassed on our western border, David replied, his voice calm, belying the tight coil of anxiety in his gut. And organized enough to bypass our outer patrols completely before sending a messenger. He looked at the unsealed parchment resting on the table beside him. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, yet entirely unfamiliar. There was no scent on the paper, just the sterile smell of the parchment itself. A deliberate tactical move. Whoever this commander was, they were careful. We should mobilize the warriors, Marcus urged. If they cross the river, we parley? David interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. We meet them at the neutral ground near the old ruins. I won't start a war based on rumors and a single letter. He rubbed his temples. The pack was stable, strong, but the peace was fragile. The neighboring packs were always testing boundaries, looking for weakness. A war with a phantom army was the last thing they needed. David closed his eyes, and unbidden, the memory surfaced. A rainy night, a slammed door, the look of utter devastation in dark, pleading eyes. He forced the image away, locking it back in the iron box in his mind where he kept everything related to her. He had done what was necessary. He had made the hard choice for the survival of his people. That was what an alpha did. The afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the stone floor as David prepared for the meeting. He wore his formal leathers, the silver wolf crest of his pack glinting on his chest. He needed to project strength, absolute and unyielding. The neutral ground was a clearing in the dense forest, marked by the crumbling stone pillars of an ancient structure. When David and his small honor guard arrived, the clearing was empty. Playing games, Marcus spat, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. Patience, David murmured. 10 minutes passed. Then the wind shifted. It wasn't a sound that alerted them, but a smell. A sudden, sharp scent that hit David like a physical blow to the chest. Rainwater on dry earth, crushed pine needles. And underneath it all, a faint, sweet note of wild honey. His breath caught in his throat. His wolf, usually a calm, dormant presence, suddenly thrashed violently within him, howling a name he hadn't allowed himself to speak in 5 years. Mate. From the shadows of the trees opposite them, figures emerged. They moved with a synchronized, eerie silence, clad in dark, practical armor. They formed a semicircle, creating a protective barrier. Then, the barrier parted. A woman stepped forward. She was dressed in dark leathers, a heavy cloak billowing slightly in the breeze. Her dark hair was braided tightly against her skull. Her face was harder, sharper than he remembered, the soft curves replaced by severe angles. But the eyes, dark, intelligent, and currently burning with a cold, contained fury, were exactly the same. David felt the ground tilt beneath his feet. The world narrowed down to the woman standing 20 paces away, the commander of the Obsidian Vanguard. "Lisa," he breathed, the words slipping out before he could stop it. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She stood tall, a queen in exile returning as a conqueror. "Alpha King David," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, stripped of any warmth or familiarity. It was the voice of a stranger. "I believe we have matters of territory to discuss." The silence that followed her statement was absolute. Even the birds in the canopy seemed to hold their breath. Marcus stood frozen, his eyes wide, looking between his alpha and the woman he had believed dead or lost forever. David's mind raced, struggling to reconcile the impossible reality before him. She was here. She was alive, and she was leading the army parked on his border. The urge to close the distance, to touch her, to confirm she wasn't a phantom conjured by his guilt, was nearly overwhelming. But her stance, rigid, defensive, flanked by warriors, held him in place. "You're alive," Marcus finally choked out, breaking the silence. Lisa's gaze flicked briefly to the beta, acknowledging him with a slight incline of her head, before returning to David. "I survived, Beta Marcus. There is a difference." The coldness in her tone was a physical ache in David's chest. "Lisa, how?" "Commander," she corrected sharply. "You will address me by my title, Alpha David, just as I address you by yours. We are not here to reminisce." David swallowed hard, forcing his wolf's frantic pacing down. He needed to be the alpha now, not the mate who had shattered their bond. "Commander, then, what is the Obsidian Vanguard doing on my borders?" Lisa took a slow, deliberate step forward. "We are claiming the disputed territory in the western quadrant, the lands between the Whitewater River and the jagged peaks." Marcus scoffed, recovering his composure. "That territory has belonged to the Silver Moon for generations. You can't just claim it." "We already have," Lisa stated simply. "My forces are encamped there. We have fortified the passes. I am here as a courtesy to inform you of the new border and to offer a non-aggression pact." David's eyes narrowed. "You're holding our lands hostage and offering peace as a concession?" "I am stating facts," she replied, her face an unreadable mask. "The Silver Moon cannot hold that territory. Your patrols are stretched thin, your supply lines are vulnerable, and your focus has been on the Eastern Pacts. The Vanguard can hold it. We will hold it." "And if I refuse?" David challenged, his voice dropping an octave. "If I order my warriors to clear the western quadrant? For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something? Sadness? Regret?" crossed Lisa's eyes. But it was gone instantly, replaced by steely resolve. "Then we will fight," she said quietly. "And you will lose more than just land." She knew his weaknesses. She had been his Luna. She knew the Pact's numbers, their strategies, their vulnerabilities. She was using his own secrets against him. "You would wage war on your own people?" David asked, the accusation heavy in the air. "My people are the ones standing behind me." Lisa shot back, the first hint of genuine anger coloring her voice. "The silver moon made it very clear 5 years ago that I was no longer one of you." The reminder felt like a blade twisting in his gut. "Lisa, you don't understand the circumstances of that night. I understand perfectly." She cut him off, her voice cracking slightly before she smoothed it out. "You made a choice. Now, I am making mine. You have 3 days to consider the non-aggression pact. If you cross the river before then, we will consider it an act of war." She didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel, her cloak swirling around her, and began to walk back into the shadows of the trees. Her warriors fell in perfectly around her, a protective shell. "Lisa, wait!" David called out, taking a step forward. She paused, looking over her shoulder. The dappled sunlight caught her face, highlighting the exhaustion and the hardened resolve there. 3 days, David," she said softly. "Don't underestimate me again." Then she was gone, swallowed by the forest, leaving behind only the scent of rain and honey, and a king whose world had just been shattered for the second time. The heavy oak doors of the packhouse war room slammed shut, with a force that rattled the ancient shields mounted on the stone walls. David stalked to the head of the massive obsidian table, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked violently beneath his skin. The scent of wild honey and rain clung to his clothes, a phantom agonizingly real, mocking his fragile composure. Beta Marcus entered a second later, quickly securing the door. Following closely behind was Elder Thorn, the oldest and most vocal member of the Silver Moon Council. Thorn's silver hair was impeccably groomed, his posture rigid with indignation. "This is an outrage, Alpha," Thorn began, his voice a rasping sneer that scraped against David's already frayed nerves. "A rogue army encamped on our sacred soil, led by a traitor? We must mobilize the vanguard. We strike tonight under the cover of darkness and wipe this obsidian coalition from existence." David turned slowly. His golden eyes, usually calm and calculating, flared with the raw, terrifying dominance of his wolf. Thorn instinctively took a half-step back, exposing his throat in a fleeting gesture of submission before recovering his pride. "They are not rogues, Thorn," David said, his voice dangerously low, a predatory rumble that commanded absolute silence. "They bypassed our perimeter without triggering a single alarm. They stood in perfect formation. That is a disciplined military unit. Led by a woman who sold our secrets to the northern packs," Thorn countered, slamming a wrinkled fist onto the table. "Need I remind you of her treason? Of the intercepted letters? The council demanded her head 5 years ago. You showed weakness by merely exiling her. Do not show weakness again, David." David's hands gripped the edge of the table, the wood groaning under his strength. The memory of those letters, sealed with Lisa's personal wax, outlining patrol routes and guard shifts, had been the poison that killed their bond. It was the irrefutable proof Thorn had laid at his feet, while the rest of the council howled for her execution. "Leave us, Elder," David commanded, not breaking eye contact. Thorn bristled. "Alpha, the council must be consulted." "I said leave us," David roared, the sheer force of his alpha aura washing over the room. The pressure was suffocating. Thorn paled, bowed stiffly, and hastily exited the war room. Once the heavy door clicked shut, the oppressive energy in the room dissipated, leaving David breathing heavily. He slumped into the heavy leather chair, burying his face in his hands. "She's alive, Marcus," he whispered. the stoic king finally cracking. 5 years of mourning a ghost, and she was out there, building an army. Marcus walked over, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He slid one across the table. She didn't just survive, David. She evolved. The look in her eyes? She hates us. David downed the liquor, letting the burn distract him from the ache in his chest. He stood abruptly and walked to a locked iron cabinet in the corner of the room. Pulling a heavy key from his neck, he unlocked it, retrieving a small, velvet-lined box. Inside were the letters. He tossed them onto the table. Look at them, Marcus. Look at the wax. Look at the handwriting. Marcus frowned, picking one up. We've seen these 100 times, David. It's her seal. But look at her now, David insisted, pacing the length of the room. The Obsidian Vanguard is a Western faction. If she was selling us to the North, why didn't she run to them for sanctuary? Why did she spend 5 years in the lawless West, uniting outcasts? It doesn't fit the profile of a mercenary traitor. Marcus slowly lowered the parchment. What are you saying, Alpha? David stopped pacing, staring at the closed door where Thorn had stood. Who found these letters, Marcus? Who intercepted the courier? It was Thorn's border patrol, Marcus said, the realization dawning slowly, drawing the blood from his face. Thorn brought them directly to the council before bringing them to you. A sickening silence descended upon the room. The pieces, long forced into the wrong puzzle, suddenly began to shift. The disputed Western territory, the land Lisa had just claimed, was the exact region Thorn had managed for decades. She didn't come back just for land, David murmured, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. She came back to cut out the rot. And she's starting with Thorn's territory. David looked out the dark window toward the western ridge. He had sacrificed his mate, his soul, to save her from a council execution based on evidence he had been too terrified and too young to properly question. I need to see her, David said, moving toward the door. David, no, Marcus warned, stepping in his path. If you cross that river, she said it's an act of war. You cannot go as the Alpha King. Then I won't, David replied, pulling the silver crest of the king from his leather tunic and tossing it onto the table. I'm going as a mate who needs answers. The Vanguard encampment was a masterpiece of tactical efficiency. Tents made of dark, weather-resistant canvas blended seamlessly into the surrounding pine forest. There were no roaring bonfires to cast silhouettes, only small, concealed, smokeless pits. Sentries moved like shadows among the branches overhead. Inside the large command tent, the severe, hardened commander of the Vanguard was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Lisa sat on a thick fur rug, a soft, genuine smile illuminating her face as she brushed her son's dark, unruly curls. Leo sat cross-legged, engaged in a fierce imaginary battle between 2 carved wooden wolves. And then the shadow wolf goes roar, and he bites the mean king's leg, Leo narrated, smashing the wooden figures together. Lisa chuckled softly, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. Is that so? And does the mean king apologize? Leo paused, his head tilting in innocent contemplation. His golden eyes, the eyes that had shattered her resolve the moment he opened them 4 years ago, shone in the lantern light. No, mean kings don't apologize, they just run away. The innocence of his words felt like a physical blow. She pulled him close, pressing a kiss to the crown of his head, inhaling the sweet, pup scent of him. He was her anchor, the only reason she had survived the brutal first winter in the West. The tent flap rustled, and General Kyle stepped inside. He immediately lowered his gaze, respectful of the private moment, though his massive frame seemed to take up half the tent. "Report," Lisa said, instantly slipping back into her armor. Her posture straightened, the soft mother vanishing to reveal the hardened strategist. Kyle cleared his throat. "The Silver Moon forces have not mobilized. Their main garrison remains at the Eastern Keep. However, our scouts report increased patrols along Thorn's old smuggling routes in the Western Quadrant. Just as you predicted." Lisa nodded, motioning for Leo to go play in the partitioned sleeping area of the tent. Once the boy was out of earshot, she stood, moving to the map table. "Thorn is panicking," Lisa murmured, tracing a finger along the Whitewater River. "The Western Quadrant is where he smuggles the silverweed extract to the rogues. By claiming this land, we've choked his supply line. He will push David to attack us to reclaim it." "And if David listens to him?" Kyle asked, crossing his arms. He had watched Lisa rebuild herself from a broken, pregnant exile into a weapon of precision. He would follow her into hell, but he worried about her proximity to the man who had broken her. "David won't attack," Lisa said, though a tremor of uncertainty laced her words. She hated how much the brief encounter had affected her. Seeing him, smelling the rain and cedar of his scent, had awakened a part of her wolf she had kept sedated for years. "He is cautious. He will want to investigate first." "He recognized you," Kale noted quietly. "I saw his face, Commander." The man looked like he had seen a ghost. Lisa gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "Let him be haunted. He made his choice 5 years ago when he handed me an exile decree while the council chanted for my blood. He threw me to the wolves, Kale. He just didn't expect me to come back leading the pack." Kyle stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Elara just signaled from the ridge. Someone crossed the river." Lisa's head snapped up. "An attack?" "No," Kyle said, his jaw tightening. "A lone wolf, moving fast, using the old hunter's blind spots. It's him, Lisa. The Alpha King is trespassing." A cold thrill of anticipation and dread washed over her. He had come. She had known he wouldn't be able to stay away, but the reality of him infiltrating her camp sent her pulse racing. "Should I have the guards intercept him?" Kale asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. Lisa stared at the map for a long moment. She glanced toward the partition where Leo was quietly humming to himself. She had to keep the boy hidden, but she also needed David to fall into her trap. "No," Lisa breathed, her eyes hardening into obsidian. "Pull the inner guards back. Leave a clear path to this tent. Let the Alpha King walk right into the den." The forest was a living, breathing entity, and David knew its rhythm better than he knew his own heartbeat. He moved silently through the dense underbrush, his footfalls making no sound on the damp earth. He had bypassed the outer vanguard sentries by utilizing a forgotten ravine that even his own patrols rarely mapped. As he neared the center of the encampment, he noted the chilling discipline of Lisa's forces. There was no idle chatter, no loose gear. It was a war camp waiting for an order. Yet, strangely, the inner perimeter around the main command tent was sparse. He didn't question his luck. His wolf was driving him forward, desperate to close the distance between him and his mate. He slipped under the heavy canvas flap of the command tent, immediately dropping into a defensive crouch in the shadows. "You always did favor your left leg when you tried to move silently, David. A remnant of that skirmish with the northern rogues, if I recall." David froze. He slowly stood, stepping into the dim light of the lantern. Lisa was seated at a small wooden desk, calmly polishing the blade of a hunting knife. She hadn't even looked up. She wore a simple white tunic and leather breeches, her dark hair cascading freely down her back. Without the heavy armor and the cloak, she looked heartbreakingly like the woman he had loved. "You let me in," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. Lisa finally looked up, setting the knife down. "I preferred to have you in my sights rather than skulking in the shadows. To what do I owe the honor of the king's treasonous trespass?" "I said 3 days, David. It hasn't been 12 hours. David took a step forward, the desperate need to touch her warring with the lethal warning in her eyes. "I didn't come to talk about territory, Lisa. I came for the truth." She scoffed, a bitter, hollow sound that cut him to the bone. "Truth? From me? Be careful, Alpha. Thorn might have you executed for conversing with a known traitor." "I looked at the letters tonight." David pushed on, closing the distance until only the desk separated them. "The letters Thorn's men found, the ones that condemned you." Lisa's expression didn't change, but her scent flared. A sharp spike of pure, unadulterated anger. "Is that supposed to mean something to me? You brought up those fabricated lies the night you threw me out. I told you then they were fake. I begged you to look at me, to use the bond to feel my truth. The council wanted you dead, Lisa," David hissed, leaning over the desk. "They demanded a public execution. Thorn had the elders in his pocket. If I had fought them, there would have been a civil war, and they would have killed you in the chaos. I exiled you to save your life." For a fraction of a second, the iron mask slipped. Her eyes widened, a flicker of shock registering before she ruthlessly clamped it down. She stood up, her face inches from his. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage so profound it shook the air between them. "You sent me into the Deadlands in the middle of winter, with nothing but the clothes on my back. You didn't save me, David. You just outsourced my murder so you wouldn't have to get blood on your hands. I made sure the Western patrols looked the other way. I left supplies at the border. I never found them." Lisa shoved him back, her physical strength shocking him. "I survived by eating bark and fighting off scavengers. Do you have any idea what it took to survive that? To build this?" She gestured wildly around the camp. "And I didn't just do it for me." "Then who did you do it for?" David demanded, his own frustration boiling over. "Mama?" The small, sleepy voice hit the tent like a thunderclap. David froze. The blood drained from his face as he slowly turned his head. Standing by the edge of a canvas partition was a small boy. He wore an oversized sleeping tunic, clutching a wooden wolf to his chest. His dark, messy curls were identical to Lisa's. But as the boy rubbed his sleepy eyes and looked up at the intruder, David stopped breathing. Staring back at him were 2 wide, perfectly round eyes, the exact devastating shade of molten gold. The silence in the tent was absolute, thick and suffocating. David's wolf let out a soul-shattering howl within his mind. "Lisa," David breathed, his voice breaking completely as he looked from the boy to the woman standing rigidly behind the desk. He's... Lisa stepped out from behind the desk, moving swiftly to place herself between David and the boy. Her eyes were no longer just cold. They were feral. "His name is Leo," Lisa said, her voice dropping to a lethal, trembling whisper. "And he is mine. You sent your Luna away, David, but you also threw away your heir." The silence in the command tent was a living, breathing thing, heavy enough to crush the breath from David's lungs. He stared at the boy, at the golden eyes that mirrored his own, at the rebellious dark curls that belonged entirely to Lisa. A violent tremor wrecked David's large frame, as the truth, brutal and absolute, tore through the lies he had lived with for 5 years. An heir, David choked out, the words scraping against his throat like broken glass. His knees gave out, hitting the woven rug with a heavy thud. The Alpha King of the Silver Moon, a man who bowed to no one, knelt before a 4-year-old boy and the woman he had shattered. Leo shrank back, his small hands clutching the fabric of Lisa's tunic. "Mama," he whispered, his bottom lip quivering. "Is he the mean king? The one who makes the shadow wolf mad?" A tear escaped Lisa's iron control, tracking a hot path down her cheek, but her posture remained rigid, protective. "It's okay, Leo. Go back to your bed. Mama is just talking to the man." Leo looked from his mother to the broken man on the floor, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound curiosity. Slowly, he retreated behind the canvas partition, though his small shadow lingered on the fabric. David reached a trembling hand toward them, his chest heaving. "Lisa, I didn't know. By the goddess, I swear to you, I didn't know you were with Pup." Would it have mattered? Lisa's voice was a whip crack in the quiet tent. "Would you have spared me because I was an incubator for your legacy, David? Or would you have let Thorn lock me in a tower until I gave birth, only to execute me afterward?" David flinched as if struck. "No, never. You were my mate, Lisa. I loved you. You loved the idea of a Luna who smiled and nodded." She roared, the sudden explosion of her anger making the tent canvas snap. "You didn't trust me. When Thorn brought you those forged letters, you didn't look me in the eye. You didn't use the bond to feel my innocence. You looked at the council, you looked at your crown, and you chose them over me." David bowed his head, a broken sob escaping his chest. His wolf howled in agony, clawing at the mental barriers, desperate to reach out and comfort his mate and pup. "I was a fool," he wept, his pride entirely stripped away. "I was a young king, terrified of a civil war. Thorn manipulated the evidence. He manipulated me. I thought exile was the only way to keep you alive. You sent a pregnant woman into the Deadlands in winter," Lisa said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I gave birth to your son in a freezing cave, David. I cut the cord with a rusted hunting knife. When he cried from hunger, I bled to feed him until I could hunt. Don't you dare sit there and tell me you saved my life." David covered his face with his hands, the image she painted burning itself into his soul. He had spent 5 years mourning a tragedy. She had spent 5 years surviving a nightmare he had created. "I came back tonight because I realized the truth about Thorn," David pleaded, looking up, his golden eyes swimming with tears. "The smuggling routes, the Western Territory. It was all him. I will kill him, Lisa. I will tear him apart with my bare hands for what he did to us." Lisa's expression hardened into an unreadable mask. She walked over to her desk and picked up her hunting knife, sliding it smoothly into the sheath on her thigh. "No, David, you won't," she commanded coldly. "Because if you act like a mindless beast, the council will turn on you, and you will lose your kingdom. Thorn has spent decades building his web. You can't just kill him. You have to dismantle him." She walked toward him, stopping just out of arm's reach. Her scent, wild honey and rain, was agonizingly close. Your 3 days are ticking, Alpha, she whispered, looking down at him. Go back to your rotting castle. Clean your house. Prove to me that you are a king worth negotiating with. Because if you don't... She glanced back at the partition where their son slept. I will march the vanguard across that river, and I will burn Silver Moon to the ground to keep my son safe. David looked up into the eyes of the woman he loved. She was no longer just his Luna. She was a queen in her own right, forged in the fires of his betrayal. I will fix this, David vowed, his voice gaining a ragged strength. He slowly rose to his feet, ignoring the aching emptiness in his chest. I will cleanse the pack, Lisa. I swear it on my life. Your life means nothing to me right now, she replied softly, turning her back to him. Show me, David. Leave. The sky above the Silver Moon pack house was a bruised, tempestuous purple by the time David returned. He strode through the heavy oak doors, not as a broken mate, but as the Alpha King. His aura, usually tightly controlled, rolled off him in suffocating waves of dominance and lethal intent. Pack members in the Grand Hall instinctively pressed their backs against the stone walls, baring their throats as he passed. Marcus! David's roar echoed through the vaulted ceilings. The beta appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his eyes widening at the blood on David's tunic from the forest thorns, and the terrifying cold fury in his Alpha's golden eyes. Summon the Elder Council, David ordered, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Now, in the throne room. Wake them if you have to. And Marcus? Yes, Alpha? Marcus asked, his heart pounding. Bring the vanguard border reports, and arm the royal guard. Only the men you trust with your life. Within the hour, the throne room was filled with the grumbling, sleep-deprived members of the council. Elder Thorn stood near the front, his silver robes impeccably draped despite the early hour. A smug, irritated expression on his weathered face. David sat upon his throne, wrapped in a heavy fur mantle. He watched them all in silence, his predator's gaze calculating. He let the quiet stretch until the murmurs died down, replaced by a suffocating, fearful tension. Alpha, Thorn finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. This is highly irregular. We are on the brink of war with a rogue faction, and you summon us in the dead of night? We are not at war, Elder Thorn, David said, his voice dangerously soft. Not with the Obsidian Vanguard, at least. He nodded to Marcus, who stepped forward and threw a heavy stack of leather-bound ledgers onto the long council table. The loud smack made several elders jump. What is the meaning of this? An elder from the eastern quadrant asked. These, David said, standing and descending the dais, are the records of the western smuggling routes. The ones that have been supplying the northern rogues with our silverweed extract and weaponry for the last 10 years. Thorn's face remained a mask of polite confusion, though his scent spiked with a sharp, sudden tang of anxiety. A tragic failure of our border patrols. As I have always said, we need tighter security in the West. Security wasn't the issue, Thorn, David growled, stepping into the elder's personal space. Leadership was. These ledgers were found in your private estate in the valley. They detail every transaction, every bribe paid to the sentries to look the other way. Gasps erupted from the council. Thorn took a step back, his face flushing with rage. This is a fabrication, a desperate ploy by that rogue whore, Lisa. She has poisoned your mind again. A feral snarl ripped from David's chest. He closed the distance in a blur of motion, his hand shooting out to wrap around Thorn's throat. He hoisted the elder off the ground, the man's silver robes pooling around David's boots. The royal guards instantly drew their blades, pointing them not at the king, but outward, at the panicking council. "You will not speak her name," David roared, his eyes flashing brilliant, predatory gold. The sheer force of his alpha command drove 3 of the weaker elders to their knees. "You framed her. You forged the letters because she was looking into the Western Quadrant's finances. You pushed for her execution to cover your own treason." "Treason," Thorn choked out, clawing at David's iron grip. "I built this pack's wealth. You are a weak boy playing at being a king. And you are a parasite who nearly murdered his Luna and his heir." David hissed, the revelation dropping like a bomb in the cavernous room. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus gasped, his sword dropping a fraction of an inch. "An heir?" Marcus breathed. David threw Thorn to the ground in disgust. The elder gasped for air, crawling backward. "Yes," David said to the room, his chest heaving. "Lisa survived, and she birthed a son. My son, the boy you all nearly condemned to death before he drew his first breath." He glared down at the pathetic figure of Elder Thorn. "Strip him of his robes, throw him in the deep cells. Anyone who stands with him will join him." Not a single council member moved. The loyal guard stepped forward, hauling a screaming, cursing Thorn to his feet and dragging him from the room. David turned back to the trembling council. "The corruption ends tonight. The Obsidian Vanguard is not our enemy. They are led by our Luna. And at dawn, I go to the river to beg for her mercy." The morning of the 3rd day broke crisp and clear, the rising sun casting a golden hue over the rushing waters of the Whitewater River. On the western bank, the Obsidian Vanguard stood in perfect formation, a wall of dark armor and disciplined silence. Lisa stood at the forefront, her heavy cloak wrapping her against the morning chill. Next to her stood General Kyle, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his broadsword. "He's coming," Kyle murmured, his enhanced hearing catching the approach before anyone else. "And he's alone." Lisa's heart gave a treacherous flutter, though her face remained an impassive mask. She watched as the tree line on the eastern bank parted. David emerged from the shadows of the pines. He wore no armor, no crown. He was dressed in simple dark leathers, his hands visibly empty. He walked to the edge of the river, the natural border between their 2 worlds. In his right hand, he carried a heavy burlap sack. With a powerful swing, he tossed it across the rushing water. It landed heavily at Lisa's feet, rolling open to reveal a tarnished silver cloak clasp, the crest of Elder Thorn. "The rot is cut out." David's voice carried over the roar of the water, raw and hoarse. "Thorn is in chains, awaiting execution for treason against the crown, the Luna, and the heir. The council has been purged." Lisa stared at the silver clasp, the physical proof of her vindication. A heavy, suffocating weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying began to lift from her chest. "And the territory?" Lisa called back, her voice steady. David stepped into the freezing water of the river, waiting until the current rushed past his knees, stopping precisely in the middle. "The western lands belong to the Obsidian Coalition," David declared loudly, ensuring every Vanguard warrior heard him. "Not as a concession, but as sovereign territory recognized by the Silver Moon. I offer a treaty of alliance, equal kingdoms, equal rulers." A ripple of shock went through the Vanguard ranks. The Alpha King was ceding ancestral land voluntarily. Kyle looked at Lisa, a silent question in his eyes. Lisa took a breath, letting the icy morning air fill her lungs. She stepped to the edge of the water, looking at the man standing in the river. He looked exhausted, older. yet somehow more like the boy she had fallen in love with than the king who had banished her. "A treaty is accepted," Lisa said, her voice ringing clear. "The borders will be respected. Trade will be negotiated." David's shoulders slumped slightly in relief, but his golden eyes remained fixed on hers. He didn't move from the water. And the commander of the vanguard. Can she ever forgive the king of the Silver Moon? Lisa's throat tightened. She looked at the man who had broken her heart. The man who had spent the last 2 days tearing down his own power structure to bring her justice. "Forgiveness is not a treaty you can sign, David," Lisa said softly, the harsh edge finally leaving her voice. "It is a bridge that has to be built, brick by brick, and it will take a very long time." A small figure broke from the tree line behind Lisa, running past the guards. "Mama!" Leo barreled into her legs, burying his face in her cloak. He peeked out, his golden eyes locking onto the large man standing in the middle of the river. "Is the mean king gone?" Leo asked, his voice carrying in the quiet morning. David's breath hitched. Slowly, carefully, he dropped to one knee right there in the freezing river, heedless of the water soaking through his leathers. He looked at his son, his heart breaking and healing all at once. "The mean king is gone, little wolf," David said, tears mingling with the river mist on his face. "There's just a man left. A man who wants to learn how to be a father, if you'll let him." Leo looked up at Lisa, a silent plea for permission. Lisa rested a gentle hand on her son's dark curls. She looked at David, seeing the absolute surrender in his eyes. They had both walked through hell, but perhaps they hadn't burned entirely to ash. "It's a long bridge, David," Lisa repeated, a tiny, genuine smile touching the corner of her lips for the first time in 5 years. "Then I'll start walking," David replied, rising from the water and taking his first slow, deliberate step toward his family. The forest witnessed the beginning of a new era that morning. The Obsidian Vanguard and the Silver Moon Pack did not merge, but they stood side by side, two sovereign powers bound by a fragile, newly mended thread. It was not a fairy tale ending of instant forgiveness, but rather the gritty, realistic start of healing. Alpha King David would spend years proving his worth to his fierce Luna and their golden-eyed heir, building trust where there was once ruin. The path was steep, but for the first time in 5 years, they were walking it together. If you were captivated by Lisa's fierce return and David's desperate fight for redemption, please like this story, share it with your fellow romance readers, and subscribe for more epic tales of betrayal, power, and enduring love.